When my neighbor built a fence 6 feet into my property, I didn't call the police. I didn't yell or threaten him. Instead, I smiled, thanked him for clarifying the boundary dispute, and told him I'd take care of it. What he didn't know was that I'm a retired civil engineer. I had the original survey maps, and I was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. By the time I was done, his house was trapped behind a concrete wall. His driveway was useless, and he was begging me to let him escape. This is the story of how silence, patience, and knowledge became the perfect revenge. My name is Robert, and for 37 years I lived in the same house on Maple Street, a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where children played on the sidewalks until the streetlights came on, and where neighbors helped each other with snow shoveling and borrowed sugar without hesitation. I bought that house when I was 28 years old, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in civil engineering, and my wife Sarah was pregnant with our first child. The house wasn't much back then, just a modest 2-story colonial with a small backyard and a maple tree that gave the street its name. But it was ours, and we loved it. Sarah planted roses along the front walkway, and I built a wooden fence around the backyard where our daughter Emily would eventually learn to ride her bike. Those were simple times, and I remember them with a kind of aching fondness that only comes when you realize how precious ordinary moments truly are. I worked for the city planning department for most of my career, reviewing construction permits, checking boundary surveys, and making sure that buildings were constructed according to code and within their legal property lines. It was meticulous work, the kind that required patience and attention to detail, and I was good at it. People used to joke that I could spot a boundary violation from 100 yards away, and they weren't wrong. I knew property law, zoning regulations, and survey procedures better than most lawyers, and I kept every document related to my own property in a fireproof safe in my basement, organized chronologically and cross-referenced. Sarah used to tease me about it, calling me her paper hoarder, but I believed in documentation, in having proof, in knowing exactly where you stood, literally and legally. When she passed away 4 years ago after a long battle with cancer, that house became more than just a home. It became a museum of our life together, every room filled with memories, every corner holding a piece of her spirit. I retired shortly after, not because I had to, but because I couldn't focus on work anymore, and I spent my days tending to her rose garden, reading in the study, and taking long walks through the neighborhood. The house next to mine had been occupied by the Hendersons, an elderly couple who were quiet and kind, and we'd lived side by side for over 2 decades without a single dispute. When Mr. Henderson died and Mrs. Henderson moved to a nursing home, the house sat empty for nearly a year, and I wondered who would move in, hoping it would be someone peaceful, someone who would respect the quiet rhythm of our street. Then, one spring morning, I saw the moving trucks pull up, and I watched from my window as a man in his mid-30s stepped out of a black SUV, talking loudly on his phone, gesturing with one hand while the movers unloaded furniture behind him. His name was Derek, and within the first week, I knew he was going to be a problem. He parked his car across both our driveways, blocked the sidewalk with his trash cans, and played music so loud that my windows rattled. I tried to be patient, telling myself he was just settling in, that things would calm down once he got comfortable, but they didn't. Derek was the kind of man who believed the world revolved around him, who thought rules were suggestions, and who had no interest in being a good neighbor. I introduced myself one Saturday afternoon, bringing over an apple pie I'd baked, the way Sarah used to do for new neighbors, and he barely looked at me, taking the pie without a thank you and closing the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, surprised and a little hurt, but I told myself to give him the benefit of the doubt, that maybe he was stressed or having a bad day. Over the next few months, the problems escalated. He threw loud parties that lasted until 3 in the morning, left his garbage bins overflowing so that raccoons scattered trash across both our yards, and parked his friends' cars on my lawn without asking. I tried talking to him several times, always polite, always calm, but he either ignored me or told me to stop bothering him. Other neighbors complained too, but Derek didn't care. He seemed to enjoy making people uncomfortable, as if it gave him some kind of power. Then, one morning in late summer, I woke up to the sound of construction. I walked outside with my coffee and saw a crew of workers digging post holes along the edge of my property, and Derek standing there with his arms crossed, watching them. My heart sank. I walked over and asked him what he was building, and he said he was putting up a fence to define the property line. I asked him if he'd checked the survey, and he laughed and said he didn't need to, that he knew where the line was. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, but I kept my voice calm. I told him I had the original survey maps and that I'd be happy to share them so we could make sure the fence was in the right place. He looked at me like I was an idiot and said he didn't need my maps, that his property went all the way to the edge of my driveway. I knew that wasn't true. I'd studied those maps 100 times. The property line was clearly marked, running 6 feet into what he was claiming as his land, and if he built that fence where he was planning, it would cut off a section of my yard that included Sarah's rose garden. I tried to explain this to him, but he cut me off, telling me to stop harassing him or he'd call the police. I stood there, watching the workers dig, and I realized that Derek wasn't just ignorant or careless. He was doing this on purpose. He wanted to take my land to push me around, to prove that he could do whatever he wanted and I couldn't stop him. I went back inside, my hands shaking, not from fear but from anger, the kind of quiet, controlled anger that comes when you know you've been wronged and you're trying to decide how to respond. I could have called the police right then, could have stopped the construction, but something told me to wait, to let him finish, to let him believe he'd won. So I did. I watched from my window as the fence went up over the next 2 days, a tall wooden structure that cut 6 feet into my property, boxing in Sarah's roses and part of my backyard. When it was finished, Derek stood in his yard, admiring his work, and when he saw me watching, he smiled and waved, a mocking little gesture that made my blood boil. But I didn't react. I just smiled back, waved, and went inside. That night, I went down to my basement, opened the fireproof safe, and pulled out the original survey maps, the property deeds, and every piece of documentation I had. I spread them out on my desk under the lamp and studied them carefully, not because I needed to confirm what I already knew, but because I was planning something that would require precision, patience, and perfect execution. Derek had made a mistake, a huge one, and he didn't even know it yet. He'd given me the justification I needed, the legal grounds to do something I'd never normally consider, and as I sat there in the quiet of my basement, surrounded by papers and memories, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This wasn't going to be about anger or revenge in the traditional sense. This was going to be about justice, about showing someone that actions have consequences, and about protecting what was mine. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was upset, but because I was thinking, planning, calculating every move like I used to do at work, and by the time the sun came up, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I got up early, made myself a strong pot of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table with the survey maps spread out in front of me. The sunlight coming through the window made the old paper almost glow, and I traced my finger along the property line, confirming what I already knew. Derek's fence was not just slightly off. It was a blatant encroachment, cutting 6 feet into my land along a stretch of nearly 50 feet. In property law, that's not a small mistake. That's theft. And what made it even more significant was the location. The strip of land he'd taken wasn't just grass and roses. It included a portion of my driveway access and a small utility easement that, according to the original subdivision plat, connected my property to the main road. Without that easement, Derek's property was technically landlocked on one side, a detail that most people wouldn't notice, but that someone with my training understood immediately. I'd worked on dozens of cases like this during my career, situations where property lines were disputed and one party tried to claim land that wasn't theirs, and I knew how these things played out legally. The problem was that going through the courts could take months, even years, and in the meantime, Derek would continue to enjoy his illegal fence, continue to taunt me, and continue to think he'd gotten away with it. I didn't want that. I wanted him to understand, quickly and undeniably, that he'd made a mistake, so I decided to handle it differently. I picked up the phone and called the county surveyor's office, asking them to send someone out to verify the property line. They said they could have someone there by the end of the week. Then I called a lawyer, an old colleague from my planning department days who specialized in property disputes, and explained the situation. He listened carefully and then said, "Robert, you have a clear-cut case. That fence is on your property and you have every right to have it removed. But if you want my advice, you should also check the historical records, because if that easement is still active, you might have more options than you think." I thanked him and hung up, feeling the pieces of my plans starting to come together. Over the next few days, I did my research. I went to the county records office and pulled every document related to our properties, going back to the original subdivision in the 1960s. What I found was even better than I'd hoped. The easement I'd noticed on my survey map was indeed still active, recorded in the county records as a perpetual access easement, meaning it couldn't be blocked or obstructed without legal consequences. And here, where it got interesting. When the subdivision was originally laid out, the developers had designed the lots in a way that gave each property access to the main road through a series of shared easements. My property had direct access, but Derek's property, the old Henderson Place, relied on an easement that ran along the edge of my land. When Derek built his fence, he didn't just encroach on my property, he also blocked his own easement access, effectively trapping himself. I sat in the records office, looking at those old maps, and I couldn't help but smile. Derek had been so arrogant, so sure that he knew better, that he hadn't even bothered to check the basics. And now, because of his mistake, I had leverage, real leverage, the kind that could turn this whole situation around. But I didn't want to just win legally. I wanted Derek to feel what I'd felt when I watched him build that fence, that sense of helplessness, of watching something wrong happen and not being able to stop it. So I started to formulate a plan, one that would be perfectly legal, completely justified, and absolutely devastating. The county surveyor came out on Thursday, a friendly woman named Linda who'd worked in the office for 20 years. I showed her my survey maps and she compared them to the county records, then spent an hour walking the property line with her equipment, placing little flags every few feet. When she was done, she came over to where I was standing and said, "Mr. Robert, your maps are correct. That fence is 6 feet onto your property. You have every right to have it removed." I thanked her and asked her to prepare an official report, which she said she'd have ready in a few days. Derek wasn't home during the survey, but when he came back that evening and saw the little flags all along his fence, he came storming over to my house, pounding on my door. I opened it calmly, and he immediately started yelling, demanding to know what I was doing, accusing me of harassing him, threatening to sue me. I let him finish, waiting until he ran out of steam, and then I said very quietly, "Derek, those flags mark the actual property line. Your fence is on my land. I've had the county surveyor confirm it, and I'm going to need you to remove it." His face turned red, and he started yelling again, saying I was lying, that I was trying to cheat him, that he'd had his own measurements done. I asked him if he'd hired a licensed surveyor, and he went quiet. He hadn't, of course. He'd just guessed, assumed, taken what he wanted without bothering to check if it was his to take. I told him he had 2 weeks to remove the fence, or I'd take legal action. He stared at me furious, and then turned and stormed back to his house, slamming his door so hard I heard it from across the yard. I went back inside, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation, because I knew what was coming next, and I knew Derek had no idea what he'd gotten himself into. Over the next week, Derek did nothing. He didn't remove the fence, didn't call a surveyor, didn't even acknowledge the situation. I think he thought I was bluffing, that I'd back down if he just ignored me. But I wasn't bluffing. I was preparing. I contacted a construction company I'd worked with during my career, a reputable firm that specialized in boundary walls and retaining structures, and I explained what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a wall, a solid concrete wall, along the exact property line, the real property line, the one confirmed by the county surveyor. The wall would be on my property, entirely legal, and it would serve to clearly mark the boundary so there could be no future disputes. But here's the thing. Because Derek's fence was 6 feet onto my property, and because my property line ran right along the edge of his driveway and his house, building a wall on the actual property line would effectively box him in. His driveway would be cut off, his side yard would be trapped, and he'd have no legal access to the main road except through the easement he'd blocked with his own fence. The construction manager, a guy named Tony who I'd known for years, looked at the plans and whistled. "Robert," he said, "this is legal, but it's going to make your neighbor's life very difficult." I nodded. "I know," I said. "That's the point." He grinned and said he'd have a crew out there the following Monday. That weekend, I sat in my backyard, looking at Sarah's roses, which were still blooming despite being on the wrong side of Derek's fence, and I thought about what I was about to do. Part of me felt guilty, like maybe I was going too far, but then I remembered the way Derek had dismissed me, the way he'd stolen my land, the way he'd shown no respect for me or anyone else in the neighborhood. And I thought about Sarah, about how she would have handled this, and I realized that she would have wanted me to stand up for myself, to protect what was ours, to not let people like Derek push me around. So I made peace with it. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. This was about showing Derek that the world didn't revolve around him, that actions have consequences, and that sometimes the quiet old man you underestimate is the most dangerous person you'll ever meet. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of cut grass and distant rain. I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen, and made myself breakfast while watching the clock. The construction crew was scheduled to arrive at 8, and I wanted to be outside when they got there, to make sure everything went according to plan. At 7:45, I walked out to my front yard and stood near the survey flags, waiting. Derek's house was quiet, his car in the driveway, and I wondered if he was still asleep or if he was watching from inside, trying to figure out what I was up to. At exactly 8 o'clock, Tony's truck pulled up, followed by 2 more trucks carrying cement mixers, wooden forms, steel rebar, and a crew of 6 workers. Tony got out, walked over to me, and shook my hand. "Morning, Robert," he said. "We ready to do this?" I nodded. "Let's get started." The crew went to work immediately, unloading equipment and setting up along the property line, using the surveyor's flags as their guide. They started at the front of the property, near the street, and began digging a trench for the foundation of the wall. The sound of machinery filled the air, and within minutes, neighbors started coming out of their houses, curious about what was happening. Mrs. Chen from across the street walked over and asked what I was building, and I explained that I was putting up a boundary wall to prevent future property disputes. She nodded sympathetically, glancing at Derek's house, and said, "It's about time someone stood up to him." Around 9 o'clock, Derek finally came outside. He was in his bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee, and when he saw the construction crew digging along the edge of his driveway, his face went pale. He rushed over, yelling at the workers to stop, demanding to know what was going on. Tony stepped in front of him and said calmly, "We're building a wall on Mr. Roberts' property. Everything we're doing is legal and permitted." Derek turned to me, his face red with anger, and shouted, "You can't do this. This is insane. You're blocking my driveway." I looked at him, keeping my voice calm and even, and said, "Derek, this wall is being built on my property, along the actual property line that was confirmed by the county surveyor. If it happens to affect your access, that's because you built your fence on my land. You created this situation, not me." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find the words, and then he turned and stormed back into his house. I heard him inside, yelling on the phone, and I knew he was calling someone, probably a lawyer or the police, trying to find a way to stop me. But I wasn't worried. I'd done my homework. I'd checked every regulation, every zoning law, every permit requirement, and everything I was doing was completely legal. The wall was on my property, it met all height and setback requirements, and I had the documentation to prove it. About an hour later, a police car pulled up and two officers got out. Derek came rushing out of his house, pointing at the construction site and talking frantically. One of the officers walked over to me and asked what was going on. I explained the situation calmly, showing him the survey maps, the county surveyor's report, and the building permit I'd obtained. He looked at everything carefully, then walked over to Tony and asked him a few questions. After a few minutes, he came back to me and said, "Mr. Robert, everything appears to be in order. As long as you're building on your own property and you have the proper permits, there's nothing we can do." Derek overheard this and started yelling again, saying it was harassment, that I was doing this to spite him, that it wasn't fair. The officer turned to him and said, "Sir, if you have a property dispute, you need to resolve it through the courts. We can't stop someone from building on their own land." Derek looked like he was about to explode, but the officers got back in their car and drove away, leaving him standing there, helpless and furious. I went back to watching the crew work, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because I was hurting Derek, but because I was finally, after months of tolerating his behavior, doing something about it. The wall went up quickly. By the end of the first day, the foundation trench was dug and filled with concrete, and the wooden forms were in place. By the end of the second day, the concrete was poured, and the wall was starting to take shape, a solid, imposing structure that ran along the property line from the street all the way to the back corner of Derek's house. It was 8 feet tall, smooth gray concrete, with no gates or openings, and it effectively cut off Derek's driveway access and his side yard. I could see him watching from his windows, packing back and forth, and I knew he was starting to realize just how bad things were about to get for him. On the third day, Derek tried a different approach. He came over to my house, not yelling this time but trying to be friendly, asking if we could talk. I invited him in, made him a cup of coffee, and listened as he tried to negotiate. He said he'd remove his fence, that he'd made a mistake, that he didn't realize it was on my property. He asked if I would stop the construction if we could just go back to how things were. I looked at him, this man who'd been so arrogant, so dismissive, so cruel, and I felt nothing but cold resolve. I said, "Derek, when you built that fence, I came to you and offered to share my survey maps. I tried to help you avoid this exact situation. You told me to stop harassing you. You laughed at me. You took my land and you didn't care. Now you want me to stop because you're realizing what you've done. I'm sorry, but no. The wall is going to be finished. If you want your access back, you'll need to work with me to find a solution, but it's going to be on my terms, not yours." He sat there, staring at his coffee, and I could see the realization sinking in, the understanding that he'd pushed too far, that he'd underestimated the quiet old man next door, and that now he was going to pay the price. He left without another word, and I watched him walk back to his house, his shoulders slumped, his confidence gone. The wall was finished by Friday. It stood tall and solid, a monument to boundaries and consequences, and it completely blocked Derek's driveway. He couldn't get his car out. He couldn't access his side yard. He was, for all practical purposes, trapped. That weekend, I sat on my porch, drinking iced tea and reading a book, and I watched as Derek tried to figure out what to do. He walked around his property, took pictures of the wall, made phone calls, and I could see the frustration and panic building. On Sunday afternoon, he came over again, this time with a lawyer, a young man in a suit who introduced himself and asked to see my documentation. I invited them both into my study, pulled out the survey maps, the county reports, the building permits, and the historical easement records, and laid them all out on the desk. The lawyer spent nearly an hour reviewing everything, asking questions, taking notes, and when he was done, he looked at Derek and said, "Mr. Derek, I'm sorry, but Mr. Robert is completely within his rights. The wall is on his property, it's legally permitted, and your fence was the encroachment. If you want access to your driveway, you'll need to negotiate an easement agreement with him, but he's under no obligation to grant you one." Derek's face went white, and he looked at me with something close to desperation, and I knew I had him. The lawyer left, and Derek stayed, sitting in my study, and he said very quietly, "What do you want?" I leaned back in my chair, looking at this man who had caused me so much frustration and anger, and I realized that what I wanted wasn't to destroy him, but to teach him something, to make him understand what he'd done. I said, "I want you to understand that respect matters. I want you to understand that you can't just take what isn't yours and expect no consequences. And I want you to be a better neighbor." He nodded slowly, and I could see that he was finally listening, really listening, maybe for the first time since he'd moved in. And in that moment, I knew that I won, not just the legal battle, but something more important, something that would change the way Derek saw the world, and maybe, just maybe, make him a better person. The days following the completion of the wall were strange and quiet, like the calm after a storm when everything feels too still, and you're not sure if it's really over or if another wave is coming. Derek stayed inside his house most of the time, and when he did come out, he avoided looking at me, keeping his head down and moving quickly, like a man who'd been humbled in a way he didn't quite know how to process. I didn't gloat or rub it in. That wasn't the point of what I'd done. The wall stood as a physical reminder of boundaries, both literal and metaphorical, and I hoped it would serve as a lesson, not just for Derek, but for anyone who thought they could take what didn't belong to them without consequences. But even as I felt a sense of justice and closure, there was a part of me that felt unsettled, not because I regretted what I'd done, but because I knew that the situation wasn't entirely resolved. Derek still needed access to his driveway, and while he was legally in the wrong, I wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed watching someone suffer indefinitely, even someone who'd wronged me. Sarah used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them, but how they treat those who have hurt them, and I thought about that a lot during those quiet days. So I decided to give Derek a choice, an opportunity to make things right, to show that he'd learned something from this experience, and to negotiate a solution that would work for both of us. One evening, about a week after the wall was finished, I walked over to his house and knocked on the door. He opened it slowly, cautiously, like he wasn't sure what to expect, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I said, "Derek, can we talk?" He nodded and stepped aside, letting me into his house. It was messy, cluttered with unpacked boxes and furniture that didn't quite fit the space, and I realized that he'd never really settled in, that he'd been too busy asserting dominance to actually make this place a home. We sat down in his living room, and I said, "I know you need access to your driveway. I'm willing to work out an easement agreement that will give you legal access through a section of my property, but there are conditions." He looked at me, wary but hopeful, and said, "What conditions?" I took a deep breath and said, "First, you remove your fence completely. Not just the part that's on my property, but the entire structure. Second, you restore the land to its original condition, including replanting the area where my wife's rose garden used to be. Third, you formally apologize in writing to me and to the other neighbors you've disrupted since you moved in. And fourth, you agree to be a respectful neighbor going forward, which means no loud parties, no blocking driveways, no trash left out, and no more taking what isn't yours." He sat there for a long moment, processing what I'd said, and I could see the conflict playing out on his face. Part of him wanted to argue, to push back, to assert that he didn't owe me anything, but another part of him, the part that was tired and defeated and maybe a little bit wiser, knew that this was the only way out. Finally, he nodded and said, "Okay, I'll do it, all of it." I felt a wave of relief, not because I'd won, but because this was the outcome I'd hoped for, the one where Derek learned his lesson without being destroyed, where justice was served but mercy was extended. I said, "Good. I'll have my lawyer draw up the easement agreement. Once you've completed the conditions, we'll sign it and you'll have your access back. He nodded again and I stood to leave, but before I reached the door, he said, Robert, I'm sorry. I was an idiot. I thought I could do whatever I wanted and I didn't think about how it affected you or anyone else. I'm sorry for everything. I turned and looked at him, and I could see that he meant it, that this wasn't just a manipulation or a last-ditch effort to get what he wanted, but a genuine realization of the harm he'd caused. I said, apology accepted. Let's move forward. Over the next 2 weeks, Derek did exactly what he'd promised. He hired a crew to remove the fence, and I watched as they tore it down piece by piece, hauling away the wood and filling in the post holes. He brought in a landscaper to restore the section of my yard that had been damaged, and together they replanted Sarah's roses, carefully arranging them the way she used to, and even though they were new plants and not the originals, it felt like a small piece of her had come back. Derek also went around the neighborhood, knocking on doors and apologizing to the people he'd offended. Mrs. Chen told me later that he'd seemed sincere, that he'd admitted he'd been a terrible neighbor and promised to do better, and she said she was willing to give him a second chance. I appreciated that about our neighborhood, the way people were willing to forgive if someone showed they were truly trying to change. Derek also wrote me a letter, a handwritten apology that was simple and direct, acknowledging his mistakes and thanking me for giving him the opportunity to make things right. I kept that letter in the drawer of my desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that people can change, that even the worst situations can sometimes lead to growth and understanding. When everything was done, I had my lawyer finalize the easement agreement. It granted Derek legal access to his driveway through a 10-foot wide strip along the edge of my property, with the condition that he maintain it, respect its boundaries, and never attempt to claim it as his own. We signed the papers in my study, with Derek's lawyer present as a witness, and when it was done, Derek shook my hand and said, "Thank you, Robert. I know I didn't deserve this." I said, "Everyone deserves a second chance, Derek, just don't waste it." After he left, I sat in my study for a long time, looking at the survey maps and the old photographs of Sarah that I kept on the wall, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The wall was still there, standing tall and solid along the property line, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a boundary, a clear and respectful division between his space and mine, and I realized that boundaries are what make good neighbors, not the absence of them. Life on Maple Street slowly returned to normal. Derek kept his word. The loud parties stopped, the trash was taken care of, and he started taking care of his property, mowing the lawn regularly and even planting some flowers along his front walkway. We weren't friends, not exactly, but we were civil, respectful, and occasionally we'd exchange a wave or a brief conversation when we saw each other outside. Other neighbors noticed the change, and the tension that had been hanging over the street for months began to lift. One afternoon, about a month after the wall was finished, I was sitting on my porch reading when Derek came over and asked if he could join me. I was surprised, but I gestured to the chair next to me, and he sat down, looking out at the street. We sat in silence for a few minutes, and then he said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about respect and consequences. I grew up thinking that being tough meant taking what you wanted and not caring what other people thought. My dad was like that. He taught me that if you don't push, you get pushed. But watching what happened with the wall, seeing how you handled everything, I realized that real strength isn't about pushing. It's about knowing your worth and standing up for it without tearing other people down." I looked at him, surprised by his honesty, and I said, "That's a hard lesson to learn, Derek. I'm glad you learned it." He nodded and said, "I've also been thinking about my dad. He died a few years ago, and I never really dealt with it. I think I was angry at him for a lot of things, and I took that anger out on everyone around me. I didn't realize I was doing it until you made me stop and look at myself." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, and we sat there together, two men who'd been adversaries and were now something closer to understanding. And I thought about how life has a way of surprising you, of taking situations that seem hopeless and turning them into opportunities for growth. As the sun set and the streetlights flickered on, Derek stood up and said, "Thanks for listening, Robert. And thanks for not giving up on me." I said, "We all need someone to believe we can do better, Derek. Now go prove me right." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and walked back to his house. I stayed on the porch a little longer, watching the stars come out, and I thought about Sarah, about how proud she would have been, not of the wall or the legal victory, but of the way I'd handled the aftermath, the way I'd chosen justice over revenge and mercy over cruelty. And for the first time since she'd passed, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was starting to heal. The months that followed were marked by a quietness that I'd almost forgotten was possible, a peace that settled over Maple Street like the first snow of winter, soft and gentle, and covering all the rough edges. Derek kept his promise in every way that mattered, and I watched as he slowly transformed from the arrogant, self-centered man who'd moved in next door into someone who seemed genuinely interested in being part of the community. He started showing up to neighborhood events, volunteering to help with the annual block party, and even joining the local community garden project that Mrs. Chen organized every spring. People were cautious at first, understandably skeptical given his past behavior, but Derek won them over with consistency, showing up when he said he would, listening more than he talked, and treating everyone with the respect he'd failed to show when he first arrived. I found myself in an unexpected position, becoming something like a mentor to Derek, though neither of us ever used that word. He'd come over in the evenings sometimes, usually on weekends, and we'd sit on my porch or in my study, and he'd ask questions about property law, about engineering, about how to handle conflicts without escalating them, and I'd share what I'd learned over my decades of work and life. It wasn't that I'd forgiven him completely, or that I'd forgotten what he'd done, but I'd decided to focus on who he was trying to become rather than who he'd been, and that shift in perspective made all the difference. There was one conversation in particular that stands out in my memory, a cold evening in November when Derek showed up at my door looking troubled. I invited him in, made us both coffee, and we sat by the fireplace in my living room. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames, and finally he said, "Robert, can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "Of course." He took a deep breath and said, "How do you deal with regret? I mean, I know I apologized and I'm trying to do better, but sometimes I lie awake at night thinking about all the things I did wrong, all the people I hurt, and I don't know how to make peace with it. It feels like no matter what I do now, it doesn't change the past." I thought about his question for a long time before answering, because it was something I'd struggled with myself, especially after Sarah died, thinking about all the times I'd been too focused on work, too distracted to really be present, all the moments I'd missed that I could never get back. Finally, I said, "Regret is a teacher, Derek. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. It's supposed to make you feel bad because that's how you know you've changed. If you didn't feel regret, it would mean you still thought what you did was okay. But here's the thing. Regret isn't supposed to paralyze you. You're supposed to learn from it, to let it shape you into someone better, and then you're supposed to move forward. You can't change the past, but you can honor it by not repeating it. That's how you make peace with regret. You let it teach you, and then you let it go." He nodded slowly, and I could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. He said, "That makes sense. Thank you." We sat there in comfortable silence, watching the fire, and I realized that this was one of the unexpected gifts of the whole situation. This unlikely connection with someone I'd initially seen as nothing but a problem, and I thought about how often we judge people based on their worst moments, without giving them the chance to show us their best. Winter settled in, and with it came the holidays, that bittersweet time of year when the neighborhood was filled with lights and music and laughter, but I felt Sarah's absence more acutely than ever. I'd always struggled with Christmas since she died, the emptiness of the house, the memories of traditions we'd shared, the quiet that replaced the joy, and this year was no different. I considered skipping the neighborhood holiday party, the annual gathering that Mrs. Chen hosted in the community center, but on the evening of the party, Derek knocked on my door and said, "You're coming tonight, right?" I hesitated, and he must have seen the reluctance on my face because he said, "Robert, I know it's hard, but you shouldn't be alone tonight. Sarah wouldn't want that." He was right, of course, and I appreciated that he'd said her name, that he acknowledged her presence in my life rather than pretending she never existed the way some people did, uncomfortable with grief and unsure how to talk about loss. So I went to the party, and Derek stayed by my side most of the evening, introducing me to people, making sure I had food and drink, and generally making sure I didn't feel alone. It was a kindness I hadn't expected, and it moved me more than I could express. At one point, Mrs. Chen pulled me aside and said, "Robert, I don't know what you did to that boy, but you changed his life. He's told half the neighborhood that you saved him, that you taught him what it means to be a man. You should be proud." I felt a lump in my throat and said, "I just held up a mirror, Mrs. Chen. He did the hard work himself." She smiled and patted my hand and said, "That's exactly what a good teacher does." As winter turned to spring, I noticed something interesting happening with the wall. What had started as a symbol of conflict had become something else entirely, a canvas for the neighborhood. Someone, I never found out who, had painted a mural on the side facing the street, a beautiful scene of the neighborhood with the maple tree at the center, surrounded by houses and people and children playing. Other neighbors added to it over time, painting flowers and birds and messages of hope and community, and the wall transformed from a barrier into a piece of art, something that brought people together rather than dividing them. Derek told me one day that he was glad the wall was there, not because it reminded him of his mistake, but because it reminded him of his second chance, of the fact that he'd been given the opportunity to change and he'd taken it. I understood what he meant. The wall was a reminder for me too, not of anger or revenge, but of the importance of standing up for yourself, of setting boundaries, and of the possibility of redemption. One afternoon in early May, I was working in Sarah's rose garden, which had grown beautifully over the past year, when Derek came over and said, "Robert, I have something to tell you. I got a job offer in another city. It's a good opportunity, a management position, and I think I'm going to take it." I felt a strange mix of emotions, happiness for him that he was moving forward with his life, but also a sense of loss, realizing that I'd come to value his presence in my life, this unlikely friendship that had grown out of conflict. I said, "That's wonderful, Derek, I'm proud of you." He smiled and said, "I wouldn't be here without you. I mean that. You could have destroyed me and you chose to teach me instead. I'll never forget that." We shook hands and I said, "Go make the most of it. And don't forget what you learned here." He promised he wouldn't, and a few weeks later, I watched as the moving trucks pulled up again, this time to take Derek away. He came over to say goodbye, and we stood there on my porch, two men who'd started as enemies and ended as something close to friends, and he said, "If you ever need anything, call me, I mean it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and watched as he drove away, the street returning to its quiet rhythm, the chapter closing on one of the most unexpected experiences of my life. The wall remained, covered in art and messages, a permanent reminder of boundaries, consequences, and second chances. And I thought about how sometimes the things we build to protect ourselves end up connecting us in ways we never expected. The seasons continued their endless cycle, and life on Maple Street moved forward with the gentle inevitability of time, each day building on the last, each moment adding another layer to the story of our little community. After Derek left, his house sat empty for a few months, and I found myself missing the conversations we'd had, the unexpected companionship that had grown out of our conflict. But I also felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that I'd played a part in helping someone find their way, that the difficult choice I'd made to build that wall had ultimately led to something positive, something meaningful. In late summer, a young family moved into Derek's old house, a couple in their early 30s with two small children, a boy and a girl who reminded me of Emily when she was that age, full of energy and curiosity and joy. Their names were Michael and Jennifer, and from the first day they arrived, they were everything Derek hadn't been: friendly, considerate, eager to be part of the neighborhood. They came over to introduce themselves, bringing homemade cookies and asking questions about the area, and I found myself enjoying their company, their enthusiasm infectious in a way that made me feel younger, more connected to the world. Michael noticed the wall immediately, of course, and asked about it, and I gave him the short version of the story, explaining that it marked the property line and had been built to resolve a boundary dispute. He looked at the mural that covered it, the artwork that the neighborhood had created, and said, "That's incredible. It's like the whole street came together to turn something negative into something beautiful." I nodded, thinking about how right he was, how the wall had become a symbol of community rather than division, and I realized that this was the final lesson of the whole experience, that even our mistakes, even our conflicts, can become opportunities for growth and connection if we let them. Jennifer asked if I'd be willing to babysit sometime, and I surprised myself by saying yes, and soon I found myself spending Saturday afternoons with their children, reading them stories, teaching them about the plants in my garden, and feeling a warmth in my heart that I hadn't felt since Emily was young. It was healing in a way I hadn't expected, this chance to be part of a family again, even in a small way, and I thought about how Sarah would have loved these children, would have spoiled them with cookies and attention, and I tried to do for them what she would have done. One evening, Michael and Jennifer invited me over for dinner, and as we sat around their table, eating pasta and laughing at the kids' silly jokes, Michael said, "Robert, we've been talking, and we want you to know that you're family to us. You've been so kind and welcoming, and the kids adore you. We're really grateful to have you as a neighbor." I felt tears prick at my eyes, unexpected and sudden, and I had to look away for a moment to compose myself. When I could speak, I said, "Thank you. That means more to me than you know. You've given me something I didn't realize I was missing." Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and in that moment, I understood that life has a way of filling the empty spaces, of bringing new people into our lives when we need them most, if we're willing to open our hearts and let them in. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn, I received an email from Derek. He, settled into his new job, was doing well, and had met someone, a woman he was serious about, and he wanted to thank me again for everything I'd taught him. He wrote, "I told her the whole story, about the fence and the wall and how you could have destroyed me but chose to help me instead, and she said she wants to meet you someday, because anyone who could have that kind of impact on my life must be pretty special. I hope you're doing well, Robert. I think about you often and I'm grateful every day for the second chance you gave me." I sat in my study, reading his email, and I felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that the ripples of that difficult summer had spread far beyond what I could have imagined, touching not just Derek but the people he would meet, the relationships he would build, the life he would live. It reminded me of something Sarah used to say, that we never really know the full impact of our actions, that every choice we make sends ripples out into the world, and the best we can do is try to make those ripples positive, to act with integrity and compassion, and hope that it makes a difference. I replied to Derek's email, congratulating him and telling him I'd be happy to meet his girlfriend whenever they came to visit, and I meant it. The wall stood as it always had, solid and permanent, but I no longer saw it as a memorial to conflict. I saw it as a testament to resilience, to the power of boundaries, to the possibility of change, and to the community that had come together to transform it into something beautiful. One crisp October afternoon, I was raking leaves in my front yard when a car pulled up and a young woman got out. She looked familiar, but it took me a moment to place her, and then I realized it was Emily, my daughter, whom I hadn't seen in over a year. She lived across the country, busy with her career and her own life, and we talked on the phone regularly but rarely had the chance to visit. She ran across the lawn and hugged me, and I held her tight, feeling the same overwhelming love I'd felt the day she was born, and she said, "Surprise, Dad. I took the week off. I wanted to come see you." We spent the week together, falling back into the easy rhythm of father and daughter, cooking meals, taking walks, talking about everything and nothing. She noticed the wall and asked about it, and I told her the whole story, from Derek's fence to the construction to the apology to the unlikely friendship that had developed. She listened carefully, and when I was done, she said, "Dad, I'm proud of you. You did the right thing, even when it was hard. Mom would be proud too." Hearing her say that broke something open inside me, and I found myself crying, really crying, for the first time since Sarah's funeral, all the grief and loneliness and fear pouring out. And Emily held me and let me cry, not trying to fix it or make it better, just being there, and I realized how much I'd needed that, how much I'd been holding inside. When I finally stopped, she said, "Dad, you don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to miss her. But you also have to keep living, keep connecting with people, keep letting yourself be happy. That's what Mom would want." I nodded, knowing she was right, and I promised her that I would. On her last day, Emily and I planted a new rosebush in the garden, a beautiful yellow variety that Sarah would have loved. And as we patted down the soil around its roots, Emily said, "This one's for Mom." So she's always here with us. I looked at the garden, at the roses that Derek had helped replant, at the new bush we just added, and I felt Sarah's presence all around me, in the flowers and the earth and the love that continued to grow even in her absence. After Emily left, I felt different, lighter somehow, as if I'd finally given myself permission to move forward, to honor Sarah's memory not by staying stuck in grief, but by living fully, by embracing the connections and opportunities that came my way. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching a class on basic property law and home maintenance, sharing the knowledge I'd accumulated over my career with people who needed it. I reconnected with old colleagues, joined a book club that Mrs. Chen organized, and even started taking ballroom dancing lessons, something Sarah and I had always talked about doing but never got around to. Life became full again, not in the same way it had been when Sarah was alive, but in a new way, a way that honored the past while embracing the future. The wall remained a constant presence, a reminder of where I'd been and how far I'd come, and whenever I looked at it, I thought about the lessons it represented, about boundaries and respect and second chances, and the power of choosing mercy over vengeance. Years passed, and Maple Street continued to evolve. Children grew up, new families moved in, old neighbors moved away, but the wall stayed, its mural growing more elaborate with each passing season as people added their own touches, their own stories, their own hopes. It became a landmark, the thing that defined our street, and people would walk by and take pictures, asking about its history, and I'd tell them the story, always ending with the same message, that conflicts are opportunities, that boundaries are necessary, that people can change, and that the measure of a community is how it turns its challenges into something beautiful. On my 75th birthday, the neighborhood threw me a party, gathering around the wall that had become our shared symbol, and as I stood there surrounded by people I loved, people who'd become my family in the years since Sarah's death, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the pain and the anger, and the choice to respond with justice rather than cruelty, and I realized that the wall wasn't really about Derek at all. It was about me, about finding my strength, about learning that standing up for yourself doesn't mean tearing others down, and about discovering that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to create something meaningful, something lasting, something that makes the world a little bit better. As the sun set and the party wound down, I stood alone for a moment in front of the wall, running my hand over the painted flowers and houses and people, and I whispered, "Thank you, Sarah, for teaching me how to love, how to forgive, and how to live." And in the quiet of that evening, with the sounds of laughter and friendship drifting through the air, I felt at peace, knowing that I'd honored her memory in the best way I could, by being the kind of man she'd always believed I was, by building boundaries when necessary, by extending grace when possible, and by choosing always to let love and justice guide my path.